right, hopefully this is coming through. Let me see. All right, my apologies. Sometimes it's a little bit awkward to get this going because there's about a 30-second lag. So I end up not knowing things are working until I can actually see myself speaking. But in any case, I will eventually get the bugs worked out, and this won't happen every time, I promise. All right. So I think now that I can see everything, I think we're just about ready to go. And let me make sure everything is still going. Yes, check, great, perfect. Okay. If for some reason people are having tech issues, please just let me know via the chat. That's probably the fastest way to directly engage with this. I don't currently have anything else open. All right. Well, thanks for bearing with me. Thanks for your patience. And just for those just joining, since I see a bunch of people have joined since I opened, these tech issues are just part of the learning curve for creating my own video, and streaming is a whole new thing. So I promise I'll get it right eventually. So anyway, now it looks like people can see me, hear me. I think we're good to go. Thanks for joining me on this second virtual office hours. This is, as I mentioned previously, something I think I'll be doing on a recurring basis, semi-regularly, not necessarily the same schedule every week, but per the poll that about 40 or 50 folks responded to earlier, they suggested that about this time of day, so sort of the beginning of the workday and Pacific time, is probably the best time for the most folks. I will occasionally do early evening live events as well, because other folks indicated that that was their second choice, and I know that some folks who have a particular work schedule that won't accommodate participating right at 9 a.m. on a weekday. Totally understand that, so I'll try and do both to catch folks on both ends of that. And this will likely be the last event of the year, but I think we'll start anew in January, and that is when I'm also going to start to have some new types of content here on the YouTube channel. I actually have a pretty exciting interview lined up with the authors of a new paper in Nature Climate Change focused on the extreme, really the extraordinary Pacific Northwest heat wave in the summer of 2021, and the role of different processes in really amping that up. Climate change, land surface feedbacks, all that kind of good stuff, which I think has a lot of relevance beyond the Pacific Northwest and for really how we think about extreme events in a warming climate, and in particular extreme heat waves. So I'm excited about that. I think I have all of the authors of the paper will be joining me for a recorded interview that we'll edit a little bit and put out later in the month, hopefully. So stay tuned for new types of content in 2023, new formats. I think the mainstay is still going to be these live informal chats that won't be edited and will just sort of go out as they are. But there will be some more formal interviews with different scientists, practitioners, folks in the community. And at some point, I will also be soliciting suggestions or self-nominations for folks who just want to have a conversation during one of these events, either live or recorded or whatever your preference is. So that's something we'll move into in 2023. I do have some folks working with me to edit some of these videos, obviously not the live ones, but the interviews I'll be doing. So fortunately, you won't have to rely on my very poor video production skills entirely. All right, so the topic of today's virtual office hours is, again, fairly broad, but I did want to focus it a little bit on the topic of drought. in California and also the broader Southwest, particularly the Colorado River Basin, since that's been in the news so much recently. And I'm leaving that deliberately open-ended because drought means different things to different people. The joke is that the drought doesn't even mean the same thing to two scientists. And while that may sound silly at the outset, there are a lot of reasons for this that actually are very real from a physical and ecological science perspective. It really does matter what your perspective is in terms of how you think about drought, how we quantify drought, and therefore how we sort of understand how drought is likely to change, because that turns out that definition of what drought is incredibly consequential for what happens to drought in a warming climate. For example, if we're just talking about precipitation-only drought metrics, as meteorologists often do, is there a precipitation deficit, for example, over some medium to long-term period of time? You might well get a different answer about what happens to drought in a warming climate in a particular place than if you take a more holistic view on what drought is, an ecological or a hydrological drought definition. For example, is there a deficit of water in the soil relative to what would typically be there at that time of year? Or are river and stream flows lower than they typically would be at a given point in time? Personally, I think that's a more meaningful indicator of drought, because the main reason we care about drought is because of the effects it has on both natural systems and human systems. And it turns out that precipitation is not the only thing that matters in that context, because of course precipitation deficit can lead to drought, but an evaporation surplus or an evaporative demand surplus can also lead to drought, and that really can come about from either decreased atmospheric humidity or increased temperatures and the increased vapor pressure deficit that comes with that. So essentially the atmosphere acting increasingly like a larger and larger sponge, extracting more and more water out of the landscape. And that can happen even if precipitation doesn't decrease. And I think this is critical because there are a lot of places that won't necessarily see a precipitation decrease in a warming climate, but are definitely going to see an evaporative demand increase, and so therefore could well see an increase in drought even if the overall average precipitation doesn't decrease much, if at all. California may be one of these places, but that's something I sort of want to get into in a moment. So just by means of a little bit more introduction to what I'm thinking about in terms of drought in a California and Southwest-centric context, just a few facts and recent findings up front before I'll start taking questions from the comments section. And again, that's going to be the primary mechanism by which I interact with the audience during these events. I do have that up on my screen and can see it as they come in, essentially, so there's only about a 30-second lag. In California, there's a perception that in this part of the world, the Pacific Southwest in particular, that in a warming climate it's just going to become perennially drier and drier with less and less precipitation. I hear this a lot when I speak to folks in the community, but also folks who work in water in this part of the world. And the interesting thing is there's really not a lot of evidence that the overall average precipitation in California is going to decrease very much, if at all. Perhaps a slight tilt in that direction in the southern third of the state, but maybe a tilt in the opposite direction in the northern third of the state in the long run in terms of the overall average precipitation. But the reality is there's not a lot of confidence regarding how overall average precipitation might change in a warming climate in California. We could get a little bit higher or could get a little bit lower, and there may be a split between the northern third versus the southern third of the state. But in any case, I don't currently expect the data currently don't suggest model simulation experiments that the overall average precipitation in California will change greatly in a warming climate. And some folks have interpreted that to mean that, we don't have to worry much about drought or flood or precipitation as the climate warms here. And the reality couldn't be further from the truth, because what we actually think is going to happen is that almost every characteristic of precipitation other than the average may change pretty dramatically in a warming climate. And in addition to that, we already know that the evaporative demand side of that landscape water balance is shifting in a direction that greatly favors increased demand. So unless we were to see a lot more precipitation on average in California, then we are going to see more frequent and severe droughts simply as a result of that increased evaporative demand. And then on the precipitation side, this is something I've touched on many times before, this notion of increasing precipitation whiplash on a variety of temporal timescales. Part of this is the seasonal contraction of a rainy season. California already has a short, relatively sharp rainy season that peaks in winter, certainly in most years, and is at its minimum in the summer, where in many places, especially along the coast, it doesn't rain at all for several months. And then we have these transition seasons in the autumn and spring where it can be highly variable, but sometimes you do get rain and snow, sometimes you don't. Increasingly, in the future, we actually expect those shoulder seasons to be really just increasingly part of the dry season in most years. Doesn't rule out individual very wet springs or autumns, but in general we expect those times of year to get drier, particularly the spring, where winter may even get slightly wetter on average, so more intense, even shorter, sharper rainy seasons. That means that we have a longer evaporation season, not just during the summer, but increasingly extending into the autumn and the spring. And on top of this, we expect to see wider swings in precipitation from very dry to very wet conditions, not only from season to season, but also within seasons. So even if our winters get slightly wetter on average, we still expect to see both drier spells and wetter spells within those overall slightly wetter winters, so wider swings within the wet season. And then we also expect to see somewhat wider swings from year to year. So more years that are very dry to some extent on one end of the spectrum, but probably an even greater increase in years that are very wet on the other side of the spectrum. So a lot of complicated things going on here. Precipitation not really decreasing on average, but potentially shifting in ways that favor longer periods of evaporation, less infiltration of precipitation into groundwater, and more immediate surface runoff, which doesn't help as much alleviate droughts. Even if we get a ton of precipitation, if it all immediately turns into runoff, it may not percolate down to where it needs to go to really recharge soil column and the aquifers, and therefore stream flows and things like that. And then we also have this increase in temperature, which itself is driving increased evaporative demand in the atmosphere. This is the concept known as the increasing vapor pressure deficit, which is something that can actually increase even if the overall relative humidity in the atmosphere stays essentially the same. So you can see increasing evaporative demand in a warming climate even if the absolute humidity and the relative humidity don't decrease, because the ceiling essentially on how much water vapor the atmosphere can hold increases faster than the floor. And so it's that widening gap that drives lots of vegetation stress. It drives increased potential evaporation from the ground, from bodies of water, etc. All right, so now that I've set the stage, I do want to open it up to questions. Again, keeping in mind that today's focus is on drought, particularly in California and in the Colorado Basin, where we've seen all of these alarming headlines about what might happen in the next couple of years on all of these major reservoirs that supply these desert cities out west and much of the southwestern agriculture in places like Southern California and Arizona, as well as other spots with the water to subsist. So again, looking for questions in the chat, and we'll be answering them as they come in. So let's see. So there's one comment that warm air holds more water, which is true. The water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere increases exponentially, in fact, for a linear increase in temperature. So the water vapor holding potential of the atmosphere increases very quickly with warming. This is one of the reasons why in so many places in the world we're already seeing an increase in the most extreme precipitation. But the flip side to that is that because the water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere increases exponentially, the actual amount of water vapor in the atmosphere does not necessarily increase exponentially as well with warming. And so this is that notion of that increase gap between the water vapor holding potential of the atmosphere and how much it's actually holding at a given moment in time. So this is the idea that the ceiling can rise faster than the floor, and so therefore the distance between the floor and the ceiling can increase in a warming climate. And so while it is true that warm air holds more water vapor, and this is one of the reasons why California is likely to see individual winters that are wetter, individual storms that are more extreme than we've seen historically, when it's not precipitating, that increased gap between how much water vapor the atmosphere could hold and how much it's actually holding is driving increased evaporation the rest of the time. And that's actually a bit of a separate issue from something else that's already been happening in the western U.S. In fact, there's an interesting talk at the American Geophysical Union this week on this topic of the fact that not only is the vapor pressure deficit increasing, this gap between the floor and the ceiling increasing, which can happen even if relative humidity stays essentially constant, but on top of that, in the Southwest in recent years, we have also seen a decrease in the absolute humidity, so actually in the relative humidity. So in the interior Southwest, despite the fact that physically speaking, a warmer atmosphere can hold exponentially more water vapor, we actually haven't seen the atmosphere hold exponentially more water vapor across the interior Southwest in recent decades. And there are some questions as to what's going on here. I think the strongest evidence at this point is it's some combination of a natural cycle plus some essentially land surface feedbacks, because the drought is now so severe that there's not really any water left to evaporate. So the only water vapor that's making it into the Southwest has to be advected by the winds, essentially blown in from somewhere else, either from the Pacific Ocean or in some cases during the monsoon, all the way from the Gulf of Mexico from the southeast. And so there's less moisture recycling, there's less water to be evaporated from the soil, from the dwindling bodies of water across the interior Southwest. And so even though the atmosphere could hold more water vapor if there were water to evaporate, if locally there's no water to evaporate, the atmosphere isn't necessarily going to hold more water vapor in a warming climate. So there's this tension emerging in the Southwest where there's some element of this that would occur even if the atmosphere did hold more water vapor on average. You might still see an increase in evaporative demand and an increase in the propensity for the atmosphere to extract that water out of the landscape. But now also what we've seen recently is the fact that the atmosphere in fact isn't holding more water vapor so far across the interior in that warming climate. That part may change, but the vapor pressure deficit increase is likely to continue to grow over time, even if we start seeing more precipitation. So there really are these profound sort of influences on the amount of the sort of the evaporative driving force of the atmosphere in a warming climate that's really not doing the interior Southwest any favors. And these are operating to varying extents across the rest of the West as well, including much of California. But it can be a little more episodic in some other parts of the West, especially the coastal regions, because of course, if you're close enough to the Pacific Ocean, that increase in water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere is more often than not realized, because there is essentially an infinite volume of water to potentially evaporate when you're over or immediately next to an ocean basin. Let's see. Questions here. So there's a question from Sabia, Sahiba. So hopefully I got that right, or something approximating correct. She writes, I'm curious on your thoughts on further drought impacts on vegetation, and on the other side, on the flooding of roots and trees falling over. I live in timberlands with high fire risk. Thanks for that. So this is one of the challenges when it comes to drought, and why I mentioned the different definitions of drought to begin with, because when it comes to drought, what the vegetation, living vegetation, actually sees is really two things. So we think about the soil being dry, right? So there being less water in the soil that plants, trees, brush, whatever you're talking about, can uptake through the roots. which is a necessary process for photosynthesis. You've got to have the water coming up. You've got to have enough water so that the plants can maintain their basic function. And in some cases, if there's a really low amount of water in the soil column, you can even get to the point where plants are demanding more water from the soil than is available. And so this can lead to plant water stress initially, and if it gets bad enough, if that deficit persists for long enough and is large enough magnitude, you can actually get plants that die quickly from that extreme water stress. This is why sometimes during extreme heat waves, like the one we've seen a few of these recently in the past few years in California, and like the one up in the Pacific Northwest in the summer of 2021 that I mentioned earlier in this conversation, you can see sudden death of vegetation in some regions where some trees just, on one extremely hot and dry day, there's just such a mismatch between how much water they need and how much is actually available in real time that can be it. They can't maintain turgor pressure, and that's it for that particular individual plant or tree. So you can see really short-term damage from extreme acute water stress just day to day during extreme hot and dry events is one thing that can happen. But the more common way in which vegetation is influenced by drought is sort of in the medium to long term, where plants have a lot of clever ways of adjusting their behavior essentially to accommodate short-term extremes. So that's actually less likely to be the cause of forest mortality, for example, than the more chronic stresses that emerge over months and even years, where there may be some water in the soil or even abundant water sometimes, but for a significant part of the growing season, for example, perhaps there's at least a partial deficit where there's enough for the plants to survive in the short term, but not enough to thrive. And then that makes, trees, for example, and this is one of the reasons we've seen so much forest mortality in California and now expanding to other parts of the West as well, is that these trees are not, unable to survive day to day. They're just sort of barely hanging on, using all the tricks up their sleeves, so to speak, to survive under water stress conditions. But then, say some other stressor comes along. So say there was a medium severity drought or a high severity drought, but it was still raining periodically. There was still some winter snowpack most of the time, but it was mainly the summers where these trees were really stressed. They can survive like that for a long time, but then say there's an additional stressor. Say a fairly high intensity fire comes through that forest, and removes a lot of the foliage or something. That may be an event that the individual trees in the forest might have been able to survive that fire. They might have even thrived after that fire if it's a fire-adapted ecosystem under normal moisture conditions, but because it's so dry, that just gives so little margin for recovery that perhaps that forest doesn't recover. That individual tree doesn't survive that fire when it would have otherwise, had there been more water available in the soil, had it not be subjected to those chronic stresses. Same thing is true of bark beetle infestations, and this is something that comes up a lot when folks say, oh, it's not climate change, it's not drought, it's bark beetles that are killing all the trees. And in a lot of cases, it is bark beetles, especially in certain coniferous species throughout the West, where it was the bark beetles that was the proximal cause of death. But for the bark beetles, they probably would still be alive. But if you dig back a little bit farther, and a lot of research supports this, a lot of these trees probably would have survived these bark beetle infestations had they had plenty of water to produce that sap to sort of push those beetles back out of the tissue, or to recover, in the years with lesser infestation. So there's sort of a double whammy effect there. Yes, the bark beetles are a big problem. They are killing a lot of trees, but a lot of these trees would have been able to survive insect infestations had they not been so water stressed, and had temperatures not been so warm that these bark beetle populations are surviving through winters. They're not being killed off by hard freezes to the same extent as they used to be. So there's a temperature and aridity component to why the forests are experiencing the kind of challenges that they are. So that's sort of the macro perspective on vegetation. I know I didn't answer the full question there, but I want to jump to some other questions. Hopefully that sparks some thought food for further conversation. All right, let's see. So there's a question about the outlook on monsoonal precipitation in Southern California and the Southwest. So just to remind everybody that there are different monsoon circulations all around the world, the most famous and substantial of which is probably the South Asian monsoon, affecting places like India and Pakistan with seasonal precipitation during the warm season. It's critically important in places where there is a monsoon, and the monsoons can fail. It would be the equivalent of the California winter season not producing precipitation when monsoons fail, which is why it's such a big deal when they do. But what is a monsoon? A lot of folks think it's a heavy downpour of precipitation, but in fact that's not what it is. A monsoon is actually a seasonal reversal of a prevailing wind pattern. So if you have winds that for most of the year come from a particular direction, and then they, for one reason or another, reverse during a particular calendar season and bring precipitation during that season, that is what a monsoon is. So these actually exist. Again, the largest and most famous one is the South Asian monsoon, but there are monsoons essentially on every continent except for Antarctica. And in North America, the monsoon, it's a weaker monsoon system. It's not quite as pronounced as it is in some other places, but the North American monsoon affects the Four Corners region, and in particular northern and northwestern Mexico. California is on the very northwestern fringe of the North American monsoon. In some years it has a more substantial influence here, in some years it doesn't. These are usually the cause of the very occasional thunderstorm events that do occur in California during the summer or fall months. They're quite rare along the coast. They're less rare in the mountains, and to a lesser extent, a little bit less rare in Southern California. So the places least susceptible to these would probably be the North Coast and perhaps the Bay Area. The place most susceptible to it would be the southeastern deserts of California, as well as the Sierra Nevada, especially along the crest and on the eastern flanks. So on the dry side, that's usually the lee side, but in fact, in summer, it's actually the windward side as those winds come up from the southeast. And the North American monsoon is actually responsible for a large fraction of annual average precipitation in a lot of the deserts in southwestern North America. So actually it has a summer rainy season in a lot of the hottest, driest places on the continent. And so, in years in which there's a good monsoon, the severity of the drought in the Southwest has been significantly mitigated. This past year was a pretty good monsoon across a lot of the Southwest. But we've also seen the worst monsoon season on record in terms of the driest on record in the past couple of years as well. So there's been a lot of pretty extreme year-to-year monsoon variability in recent years. And a lot of this is to say, in terms of the core monsoon region, we actually don't know a whole lot about how it might change in a warming climate because we don't understand it very well. It's really subject to fairly subtle land-sea interactions and topographic interactions with the mean flow of the tropics and subtropics that are not really well captured in a lot of the flagship coarse resolution climate models that we use to make a lot of these projections. So the Southwest monsoon is not a high confidence future projection, but there are a few aspects of it that are likely to be the case. We are likely to see more whiplash precipitation during the monsoon, so there will be ever more intense monsoon downpours with greater risk of flash flooding. That much is quite clear. But we also may see more dry spells and even dry monsoon periods overall. So this is sort of similar to California, except in the opposite season, since this is mainly occurring in the summer. My guess is there will be more boom years and more bust years, and a lot more flash flood risk in the boom years especially. But California, as I mentioned, is sort of at this northwestern flank of the monsoon, where in some years it's pretty influential, other years it's almost entirely absent. And in any case, it's usually pretty unimportant along the coast anyway. That may change a bit. There are, again, subject to a lot of uncertainty, but just sort of the initial indications are that although California is very unlikely to start seeing significantly more, in absolute terms, summer precipitation, in relative terms, there could be a meaningful increase in the risk of summer thunderstorm events. Not necessarily bringing a lot of precipitation, because of course the most common amount of summer thunderstorm precipitation in places like San Francisco is 0. So even, it's nominally above 0. There might be one event every several years, perhaps. So even doubling that from, one event every 3 or 4 years to one event every other year, it's still not a very common occurrence. But there is some indication that across much of California, that the relative likelihood of having these northwesterly extent monsoonal surges may increase. And so there may be a slightly increased possibility of occasional summer thunderstorms in California in a warming climate. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't necessarily mean they're wet thunderstorms. Part of this could be an increase in the risk of dry lightning as well as wet thunderstorms. And so this could pose potentially an increased fire weather concern in a warming climate that sort of hasn't been explored yet. I'm going out a little bit on a limb here because honestly there just isn't a lot of research into this and not a lot of evidence either way. But this is what the very initial indicators seem to suggest at the moment. So right now that's probably all I've got to say about that. So we don't really know what happens to the core monsoon except that the wettest events get wetter and perhaps the driest events get drier. It's not clear what's happening on average. California is still going to be at the very periphery of the monsoon, but there may be a bit of an increase in the likelihood or the extent to which those monsoonal incursions produce, I guess you could call it, interesting weather of some kind over California during the summer months. All right, let's see. So there's a question from Noah about the fact that there are anecdotally more storm closures at resorts, I'm assuming ski resorts, and this question about latest thinking regarding changing snowpack and snowfall patterns in the Sierra. This is an interesting one because I think what we've seen is that extreme snowfall events in the Sierra Nevada, and in fact in a lot of places, have not really decreased. In fact, at the very highest elevations, we're talking like 8, 9, 10,000 feet, there's some evidence that the most extreme snowfall events may actually be even slightly increasing in a warming climate, which may sound odd until you think about it this way. In a warming climate, the clearest effect is that the wettest storms get wetter. And even if the wettest storms are getting significantly warmer, if you're at a high enough elevation, you're still below freezing, even if you've warmed several degrees. So if your storm started out at 26, 27 degrees, and now it's 30, 31 degrees, that's much warmer, but that's still below freezing, and so you're still going to get precipitation falling as snow in those places. And so if there's more water in the atmosphere now, it's going to fall as heavier snow. The problem is there's not a lot of land at that elevation, so there's this paradoxical effect where the top of the chairlifts at some of the biggest ski resorts are seeing kind of a different response to climate change than the vast majority of the mountain chain. So this is you can sort of experience this as the difference between what's going on, say, in like populated parts of South Lake Tahoe versus the top of the chairlifts at Heavenly or something like that. There's a significant elevational difference, and this is sort of the difference between, at South Lake Tahoe, for example, we're seeing more and more storms that, as they warm, 2 or 3 degrees, they go from being maybe 30 degrees to instead being 33 degrees, and that's a really consequential threshold, of course, because you go from one side of the freezing line to the other, and so all of a sudden you see a large decrease in the amount of snow during many events, not because the moisture is decreased, but because the temperature just favors rain now rather than snow. But further up the mountain, that same 3-degree decrease might have been from 26, 27, 28, 29 degrees, 30 degrees. It's just as, you're seeing the same amount of warming, but it is still producing snow, and it may be even producing more extreme snow at elevation. So, this is the real challenge, is that there's not a lot of land, in the Sierra Nevada above 8,000, 9,000 feet. There is some, obviously, but very few people live there. And more importantly, from a water supply perspective and an ecological perspective, most ecosystems and most watersheds exist primarily below those elevations. So it's almost a top of the chairlift novelty, if you can think of it this way. We're in a warming climate, at least for the next few decades. We may see potentially more and more extreme snowfall at the high end of the scale. So the most extreme snowfall events will likely remain just as extreme as they were historically, if not become more so at 8, 9, 10,000 feet. This is true throughout the West, Whereas, the snowfall at elevations that are more ordinary, where people actually live, 4, 5, 6,000 feet, it's going to dramatically decrease. So we see kind of this dipole with huge decreases below a certain elevation and little decrease or maybe even a slight increase in snowfall at very high elevations. So on average, what this does for the water supply is not good, because it means that more of the storms that do occur are going to produce more rain at higher elevations rather than snow, meaning more immediate runoff, significantly increasing flood risk, because again, most of these watersheds exist below that 7,000 or 8,000 foot elevation, and also meaning that we no longer have such a reliable time-release snowpack. So the fact that the snowpack that we do have will be less substantial and melt earlier or immediately, not even really forming in the first place, at elevations where we'd really want it to stick around the spring and summer months. That snowpack up at 9,000 feet might be doing fine, but again, there's just not that much of it at that elevation. It can be very deep, but it just isn't very extensive because there's only so much land that's that high up. So there's some interesting things going on with snowfall, and the extreme snow events in a lot of places seem to be decreasing less or not at all than the average snowfall. So we've seen this even in places that close to sea level, like the eastern seaboard of the United States. Like Boston, New York, Washington, D.C. have all seen enormous snowfalls. In a lot of cases, some of the heaviest snowfalls in like a century or two of record keeping have happened in the past decade or so in those places, even though the average temperature and the average snowfall has dramatically shifted, warmer temperatures and less snowfall overall, and yet they're still getting snowmageddon events. So there's these interesting sort of dipole where the most extreme events are changing differently than the average conditions, and we see this every time I look at something new. This is happening for precipitation in California, for extreme snowfall versus mean snowfall in lots of other places. There's some question about whether it's happening with temperatures in some places as well. So once again, an example of an event, of sort of a physical process where we really need to focus on the extremes if we're talking about the extremes, and we cannot infer changes in the extremes just from what's happening on average to ordinary events. All right, let's see. Let's see what we've got here. There's a question about here. We've got there's a follow-up comment from Noah about how when it comes to ski resort specific closures, there's a lot of decisions at play other than the storm severity or the absolute amount of snow. I mean, it's also possible that as more and more people go up there, there's more risk aversion, liability, things like that. So I'm not qualified to comment on the details there, except to say that it is true that at very high elevations, we're not seeing a decrease in extreme snowfall, and perhaps even a slight increase. But of course, there are other things that play into decision making in that realm as well. Another question, this one from Marie, about who writes, I seem to remember something about Kansas and Oklahoma groundwater being depleted, and I wonder if that has something to do with keeping moisture in the atmosphere in that area through condensation. So there's a lot of things going on. I think that's a reference to the Ogallala Aquifer, which exists sort of on the high plains. It's the same one of the aquifers that was so drawn down during the Dust Bowl era. The Dust Bowl, of course, extended across the southern plains as well. But the Ogallala has been heavily drawn upon by human activities to provide irrigation in a lot of the plain states. So, west of a certain longitude, but east of the Rocky Mountain Front Range, it's pretty dry. There's not a lot of moisture because all that Pacific moisture gets squeezed out by the mountains, and essentially it's in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains. There is some moisture that comes into the region from the south, from the Gulf of Mexico, because there's no topographic barrier between the Great Plains and the Gulf of Mexico. But in general, the high plains, sort of from eastern Colorado into Nebraska, Oklahoma, that area, can be pretty dry. Despite that, there's a lot of agriculture in that region. And how is that supported? Some of it is rain-fed to the extent that there's rain that occurs during the spring and summer during the storm season. This is also Tornado Alley, so a lot of these storms that produce rain also produce all kinds of severe weather. But a lot of the agriculture is supported by heavy-duty groundwater pumping from the Ogallala Aquifer. And that aquifer is continually being drawn down more and more in a very unsustainable way. The reason I'm talking about this, even though it's not related to California, is that it's not that different from the problem, and from a groundwater sustainability perspective, as the one faced by in California's Central Valley or some of the basins in Arizona that would otherwise be fed by tributaries to the Colorado River, for example. There's a couple things going on here, and this actually is a good segue into talking about the other dimension of drought. So I've focused on the physical elements here. So you have obviously a precipitation deficit as part of drought. An evaporative demand surplus is the other half of the drought equation, and I think we need to be talking about both of those, because how much water is left at the end of the day is a function of both of these things. And climate change is especially affecting the evaporative demand side, so it's really pushing towards increased drought severity in that direction, irrespective of what it's doing to precipitation locally. And it's doing different things to precipitation in different regions. Some regions getting wetter, some regions getting drier from a precipitation perspective. California is kind of doing both at different times, but isn't seeing much average change in precipitation overall. But the sort of the human intervention in water is the other dimension to drought that is really important. And on the high plains, on the Ogallala Aquifer, there is this eventually going to be a day of reckoning where the Ogallala essentially goes dry, somewhat due to climate conditions, but actually more due to the fact that humans have just been pumping water unsustainably, more and more straws in the aquifer, and there's not enough water going back into it to recharge it sustainably. Same thing is true in California, especially in the Central Valley and in certain parts of the San Joaquin Valley in particular, but also smaller basins elsewhere in the state, as well as in Arizona. And this is because humans have a tendency to draw upon groundwater during periods of scarcity. And the problem is, in the Southwest now, we've sort of entered the semi-permanent or /permanent period of scarcity because of the increasing temperatures and the increasing atmospheric demand for water. So we're drawing upon groundwater, which some folks and geologists call fossil water, because it's water that actually went down there a long time ago and took, decades, centuries, or even longer to accumulate in these aquifers. This isn't like it rains heavily one day and the aquifer is magically refilled, or even over the few years. It takes a really long time. And we're not really letting that water replenish in most cases. We're still pumping more water out than is going in. And so in California, there's something called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that has been nominally designed to make groundwater management sustainable in the long run, but there have been some criticisms of it that in the short run it actually might make things worse, and that even in the long run it doesn't account for all of the considerations that we're going to have to be dealing with in a warming and changing climate. So California's groundwater situation is not solved by any means. There is legislation on the books that will hopefully help in the long run, but in the short term, things may get worse before they get better. And this is really important to figure out, because this is going to be something that we're going to have to manage better if we want to have sustainability of water overall in a warming climate, because it is nice to have that buffer of water stored underground for when the atmosphere isn't delivering during a particular period of time. But if we want to be able to draw upon that reliably, we have to not overutilize it, in the meantime. And so, one of the things to tie together some disparate threads here that we've really been talking about, and I'll talk about this later in a dedicated virtual office hours focusing on the opposite end of the spectrum, the increasing flood risk in California and other places in a warming climate. But one of the things, the opportunities that affords, because California's overall average precipitation isn't really decreasing, it's just coming in different forms and different times and in sharper bursts, that's both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge because it increases flood risk and makes our current water management and supply systems increasingly obsolete and out of phase with what we're observing. But it also gives us an opportunity because, if the climate were just making it rain less and less and snow less and less everywhere all the time, that would be a bit of a different challenge than getting water delivered in bigger bursts more inconveniently with more evaporation in between. The water still is going to get here. in some form or another and at some point. The question is, can we harness these big bursts of water more realistically, more in a way that better accommodates the physical reality? And so if we're going to see larger flood flows, and we have this, this groundwater, these aquifers that we're just pumping more and more water out of in an unsustainable way, is there any way that we can actively try and use some of these periodic bursts of water to recharge those aquifers, not completely, but certainly at a faster rate than is occurring naturally? And I think the answer is yes, that is something that could be done. And there's a lot of movement right now at the state level, the Department of Water Resources, private NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, the private water agencies and water rights holders who are really interested in this. And I think there's a lot of evidence at this point that this is a more promising approach than building big new dams, which just become flood hazard liabilities potentially and don't really help us much because we can never store a significant fraction of all the water that falls as precipitation in a given year anyway in California. There's just way too much volume. We'd need dams thousands and thousands of feet high, which of course is not physically realistic. So the goal shouldn't be to capture all that water immediately as it falls behind big dams, but one goal might be to harness a lot of that water and actively move it to places, pre-dedicated places, where it can actively recharge those aquifers. And you can't just put it anywhere and just cross your fingers and hope for the best. There are certain areas geologically that are much more favorable for groundwater recharge than others. And so this will require infrastructure building and retooling water policy. So you'll need to build water transport infrastructure, so conduits, whether it's pipelines or channels or whatever it is, to move water to places, on relatively short notice when it is available in these big bursts, to places where it will actually do some good and recharge some of these overdrafted aquifers. It's easier said than done, but I also think it's easier done than a lot of the other kinds of interventions that folks have proposed for enormous infrastructure projects for California water. This one is actually modest by comparisons, and I think it would potentially both decrease the risk of flood or shave off some of the worst flood risk because you'd be able to pre-allocate water somewhere else where you essentially determine it's okay if it floods for a little while. Hopefully it'll do some recharging while also hedging against the risks of the inevitable next drought to follow, because you've banked some of that water underground, and instead of just trying to flush floodwater out to the ocean as fast as possible during these really big flood events, allowing some of it to sit in areas where it will percolate down and recharge aquifers, I think would be a better approach, given that there's already going to be plenty of water headed out to the ocean during these events anyway. All right, let's just see what other new questions are coming in now. Yeah, there's a question from John, and this may be the last question I take today, since I see we've got about 5 minutes left in the hour. Might give it a few extra minutes since I started a few minutes late due to some technical difficulties, so maybe I can take one more after that. John asks if I know whether water managers are considering changes to the way they store water in lakes and reservoirs. For example, lakes like Shasta and Oroville have flood pools until certain times. So this is a good question. The flood pool is a reference essentially to a safety margin, if you will, on critical dam infrastructure, where you really, if you're a dam operator and you have a big storm, you never ever want to get to a point where the amount of water coming into the reservoir is significantly greater than the amount that you can let go from the reservoir, because eventually that non-equilibrium can lead to water that rises to the top of the dam level and goes over the top of the dam. And anybody who's a civil engineer knows that water falling hundreds of feet down a dam face to the base of the dam is essentially an emergency, because that can result in stability issues in the dam itself. So, historically, when that has happened on some dams that are not specifically designed to accommodate it, and many are not, that has resulted in catastrophic failure. So, in other words, you never want water to flow over the top of a dam and fall down onto the dam face unless the dam is designed specifically to accommodate it. So you always want to have a margin of error, a margin essentially where the dam, you don't want it to be completely full right before a big storm. You always want to leave some margin for flood control and for dam safety. And depending on the dam operator, this works a little bit differently depending on who owns the dam, whether it's the state or the federal government or whatever. But the Army Corps of Engineers is heavily involved in setting rule curves and essentially operational constraints on safety margins from a dam safety and a flood control perspective. The problem with this is they're usually not dynamic numbers. They're sort of like a fixed number that during the quote-unquote wet season in California, you need to maintain, X number of acre feet or X number of vertical feet of headroom to accommodate, a big sudden inflow. And there is some movement towards making that number not a static fixed number, but a number that evolves over time depending on the conditions. So if you're in the middle of a drought, for example, and there's no storms on the horizon, maybe you can afford to keep a little more water in the dam because there's a very low chance of having a sudden inflow that would compromise safety. This is sort of the basis for what's known as forecast-informed reservoir operations. It's the FIRO acronym. And this is kind of exciting because it's really only come into being because we now have really good weather forecasts out, certainly 3 to 5 days, and we have some vague hints, at a week or 10 days, even longer sometimes, about the likelihood of a really major storm sequence that would be a concern from a dam safety perspective or a flood control perspective. And so essentially the idea is that on some specific dams that have been approved in coordination with the Army Corps, the dam operator, and certain weather forecast authorities, that these dam operations are now dynamic in concert with weather forecasts. So if there's absolutely no rain on the horizon for weeks, even if it's the middle of the wet season, you can retain more water. It's safe, essentially presumed safe, to have less headroom. This is a way that may help us hedge against water scarcity in a warming climate a little bit, because it means that we don't have to waste, if you will, quite so much headroom from a flood and dam safety perspective, because we do know if a big storm is coming a few days out. We don't need to pretend that it's a complete mystery and that we don't have weather forecasts, because we do. And it's still a very risk-averse approach. If there's even a possibility of a large inflow event, that already starts to shift the rule curves back in the direction that they would have been in their static historical form. But if you really just have these periods, these multi-week periods of high pressure, low or no precipitation, then maybe those don't need to be times in which we're letting all this water go from the dams during a drought. So there are movements in that direction. I think that's a really smart move, because it doesn't necessarily involve any new physical infrastructure. It just involves sort of human and computational infrastructure to make those forecasts, and then policy infrastructure to shift policies in a way that allows that to even take place in the first place, away from sort of these historical rigid rules to more flexible ones that actually take into account the conditions on the ground in the given moment. All right. Well, I don't see any major new questions coming in. This is actually the flow of questions and comments in this chat was quite manageable relative to some of these live events I've done where there's 10 or 20 per second. So for now, I think this is probably a good audience size. As much as it would be great to have larger audiences, maybe it's nice if it's a modest sized group each time, because I actually get to answer most questions. I know I didn't quite get to everything, but hopefully, that's the nice thing about these. There will be a next time. And I don't have a specific date yet for the next one. It might be in the new year. And if so, I hope everyone has a good holiday season, and I will see you in just a couple of weeks, most likely. All right. Thank you.